Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I'd review this little video that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video by the boxing channel known as DontaesBoxingNation. Of course, a channel that I like to review quite a bit. Once again, because there's certain narratives and certain standards and certain biases that I believe that I can kind of commentate on. And that's a big part of the reason why I started this channel, was to expose certain double standards and narratives overall and biases. And in this video, it pretty much is going to be perfect because I'm going to be able to actually talk about two sides of the coin. And of course, for those of you that have not heard in the recent news, and some of you may have not heard about this because I did not hear about this until recent, but apparently Mr. Jose Benavidez Sr., at least I believe that that's his name, David and Jose Benavidez' father, the Benavidez' brother's father, he recently overall stated in an interview that he finds Terence Bud Crawford to not be quite an interesting fighter, or to be a quote-unquote boring fighter. And the reason why I thought that I would talk about this is because you're going to see both sides of the coin. You're going to see what a lot of certain fighters or certain coaches or, maybe certain fight fans love to do to certain black fighters that are very highly skilled, which is call them overall quote-unquote boring, even if they do appear maybe to have a little bit more of an entertaining style. Now, is that me trying to state that you have to find Terence Bud Crawford the most interesting fighter on the planet? No, not necessarily. But, when it comes to certain standards of a fighter being quote unquote entertaining or a fighter being quote unquote boring, a lot of the times overall people will call a fighter boring because they do have a personal distaste for them. It's usually not because of the style, it's usually because they don't want that fighter to be as dominant as what they want that fighter to be. Now, are there certain fighters that of course, are a little bit more of an acquired taste and maybe not for everybody, such as a Guillermo Rigondeaux or an Erisani Lara or a Shakur Stevenson? Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this conversation was quite interesting because depending on a lot of the times the demographic of the fighter, what you'll find out a lot of the times within that of the boxing sphere or the boxing circle is that they may find that fighter quote unquote boring or not likable, pretty much particularly because of their demographic, or because of their race. So when Dante's Boxing Nation does say that a lot of the times that boxing is based on race, nationality, and pride, he is very much correct. It pretty much always has been, especially because it is a fighting sport, and a fighting sport has so much pride on the line, and there is so much, overall survival and pride instincts there. And of course, the racial thing, it is going to be a part of that. It's always going to be a part of that. It just is what it is. To be honest with you, the racial aspect is going to be a part of that really in all sports, but especially whenever it comes to individual sports, especially in that of the sport of fighting. But it is what it is. Anyways, the reason why I also thought that I would talk about this is because a lot of the times, because of the double standards that are shown by some that of boxing channels or boxing fans, and some of the double standards and some of the harsher critiques against that of black fighters and not holding the same standards to other demographics of fighters, Dante's Boxing Nation and a lot of these LDBC and new media channels, they try to make some of their favorite black fighters into something that they're not. And what Dante's Boxing Nation is trying to make Terence Bud Crawford into is this mega superstar, this guy that is quote unquote debatably the new face of boxing, or someone that is up there. And we know that, of course, Dante's Boxing Nation has been trying for a very, very long time, as well as many other people from the LDBC and new media. They've been trying to claim that someone other than Canelo Alvarez has been the main face of boxing. They want you to try to accept facts about Gervonta Tank Davis or Terence Bud Crawford, about the attendance venue and the pay-per-view numbers, and oh look, Gervonta Tank Davis did 1.2 million pay-per-view buys with Ryan Garcia. He must be the quote-unquote face of boxing. Well, if you take a look at the consistent numbers, no matter who he ends up facing, the face of boxing is still Canelo Alvarez. And to be quite honest with you, it's really not that close. And the reason why I say it's not that close is because when you take a look at Terence Bud Crawford's last pay-per-view, which was a pretty good card, with Jarrell Big Baby Miller versus Andrew Ruiz and Andy Cruz on that card, and I believe another good card on that fight card. I believe Isaac Pitbull Cruz versus Jose Valenzuela, some fighters that were decently known on that card, especially some Mexican fighters, and Terence Bud Crawford. And from what I hear, the most amount that fight card did was 200,000 pay-per-view buys. I'm not even quite sure if it did that. Gervonta Tank Davis recently against Frank Martin, when he was not facing one of the main faces of boxing in terms of publicity, and popularity in that of Ryan Garcia, the man, I believe, only did about 350,000 pay-per-view buys, but no one is talking about it. So the facts of the situation are this. You can criticize Canelo Alvarez all you want to about some of the fights that he's picking, and I do think that it is relevant to criticize Canelo Alvarez for trying to make the Edgar Berlanga fight, but not really trying to put in any effort to make the David Benavidez or the David Morrell fights. I think that that's a very fair critique. But what we cannot dispute, if we're going to talk about quote-unquote factual information, is who the real face of boxing is. And that right now still is Canelo Alvarez. Now, could it, of course, be a little bit changed later on? Yes, of course it could be. But right now, Canelo Alvarez, with his last fight against Jaime Munguia, he did 550,000 pay-per-view buys. And when you talk about it, the man, I don't even remember what his undercard was for those fights. When you talk about Crawford, the man had Andy Ruiz versus Jarrell Big Baby Miller on his undercard. He had Andy Cruz on his undercard. I believe that he had David Morrell on his undercard. He had that of Isaac Pitbull Cruz versus Jose Valenzuela on his undercard. When you talk about Gervonta Tank Davis, not only did he have himself versus Frank Martin, but of course he also had David Benavidez versus Alexander Vosdik. Canelo Alvarez, I don't even remember what any of his undercards were. I just remember him versus Jaime Munguia, and the man did at least 550,000 pay-per-view buys. Once again, it's really not even competitive. Canelo Alvarez right now still is the main face of boxing. They've been trying to detract him for a very long time because not only do they want to make you believe that Canelo is overrated as a fighter, but they also want to make you believe that his hype machine is quote-unquote dying. And what I will say is this. If Canelo is not going to try to get in the ring with David Benavidez nor David Morrell at all, eventually the numbers are going to drip down. But the card, I do believe, is very good as of recent, not just with Canelo Alvarez versus that of a Edgar Berlanga, which is a relatively entertaining fight. I don't think it's a great fight, but at least Edgar Berlanga is a quote-unquote entertaining fighter to most people. It's a decent card. But of course, you also have Danny Garcia versus Araceli Lara, which is a great fight in my view. And you have a couple of other decent fights on there as well. So that's going to be a very entertaining fight card. We'll see what happens. But once again, I just wanted to talk about that because when it comes to not just boxing fans, but fans in general, they love to quote-unquote state facts whenever it's very apparent about the stuff that they want. But then when it's about the stuff that they don't want, then all of a sudden they push it to the side or they'll make excuses. And if we're going to be logical or objective commentators, we can't do that. We have to present the facts that are right in front of our face. And we overall can't make any ifs, ands, or buts about it. It just is what it is. Now, that does not mean that, of course, we cannot have context behind it. Of course, there's context behind everything. But at the end of the day, the facts of the situation are this. Terence Crawford, in my view, when you talk about just subjectively, I think that he's a very entertaining fighter. And do I think that, of course, that Crawford deals with a lot of double standards because he is a quote-unquote black fighter? Yes, I do. But he also is not the main face of boxing, and he's not a big superstar. He just never has been. Crawford is not that type of guy, and it's been revealed time and time again by his pay-per-view numbers. Every time he's had a pay-per-view headliner, he's always underwhelmed. It just is what it is. But anyways, back to the video. Let's see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? I tell you guys all the time, the most dangerous weapon in the world is a microphone and a camera. And it just amazes me how so many people get on a microphone not realizing, depending on what you say, it will result in consequences, for better or worse. David Benavidez's father and trainer recently came out, Jose Benavidez. He comes out of nowhere saying that Crawford is not an exciting fighter compared to his son, who takes risk. He said that Crawford doesn't take risk. He plays it safe, and Crawford reminds him of a Shakur Stevenson. I want to go ahead and play the clip of what he said, and then I'm going to completely unpack this. Check this out.
I'm not even going to compare David to Terence Crawford. David's an exciting fighter. David comes and throws punches. David comes and risks a lot. He comes and puts a performance. Terence Crawford's a really good fighter. He always plays it safe. He wants to win the rounds, but I don't think that he risks. And he doesn't give that people excitement, that, he's going to come and have a good fight. To me, Terence Crawford's like a Shakur Stevenson,
Well, Mr. Jose Benavidez, this is first of all what I have to say. First of all, when it comes down to it, comparing Crawford to a Shakur Stevenson, I can't completely agree with that. Now, to be honest with you, what I will state is this. Shakur Stevenson, in my view, he actually is a lot like a Terence Bud Crawford. He fights a lot like him. You can tell that in their sparring sessions that he's taken a lot of the same traps and a lot of the same little nooks and crannies overall that Terence Bud Crawford has adjusted to his game. But when it comes down to it overall, no, I can't claim that Terence Bud Crawford is right there with Shakur Stevenson, because I can actually understand why someone would look at Shakur Stevenson and claim that he's quote unquote boring, because Shakur Stevenson is not getting anybody out of there. And the problem is that Shakur Stevenson isn't just not getting certain fighters out of there, but the problem is that he's not getting certain guys that would be looked at as B or C grade level fighters out of there. Like, the man is not getting anybody out of there. And that's the problem. The Edwin De Los Santos fight was absolutely awful when you talk about in terms of entertainment value. And the last person that he fought, to be quite honest with you, I can't even remember the last person that he fought. Maybe the last person was Edwin De Los Santos. I can't remember. I think, of course, the next guy that he's going to fight is that one British fighter, Corda, or whatever the hell his name is. I can't remember overall what that dude's name is. The dude that just came off of a knockout loss against a Northern Irish fighter, or an Irish fighter, I believe. But anyways, when it comes down to the overall, Shakur Stevenson, great fighter. But Terence Bud Crawford, in my view, he's more skilled, and he just brings more to the table than what a Shakur Stevenson does, especially in terms of entertainment and in terms of punching power. Terence Bud Crawford, say whatever you want about him. No, I don't always think that the welterweight competition was the best, but he did end up getting all stoppages there, and some of those fighters were undefeated. So if we want to make that comparison, Shakur Stevenson is fighting fighters that he probably should be stopping, but he can't do it.
Per pound, Terence Crawford's a good fighter, I think, but to me, he's not exciting. To me, it's like, he always plays it safe. He wins the rounds, and that's it. So I can't even.
Right, but he always plays it safe in what way? Because Terence Bud Crawford is getting stoppage after stoppage after stoppage, at least in the welterweight division. So is it mainly because Terence Bud Crawford just doesn't come forward the whole entire time and throw punches and bunches and fights one-dimensionally like your son, David Benavidez? Is that the reason why Jose Benavidez? It's no offense, but the reason why most people call a lot of these black fighters quote-unquote boring is because they're a little bit insecure that their fighters or their sons or something like that they can't do what the best black fighters can do. It just is what it is, and I've seen this time and time again. That's why a lot of the times whenever it comes to certain fighters like Mayweather or certain guys like that or Crawford, they call them quote-unquote runners. But even if they bring great knockout value like a Crawford or a Gervonta Tank Davis, they will still somewhat get criticized. So a lot of the points that Dante's Boxing Nation brings to the table, they are very relevant. I don't think that a lot of the stuff that he says or that some of the stuff that he says is just completely irrelevant. The problem with Dante is that he does the exact same shit just with non-black fighters. Dante's Boxing Nation is pretty much like that of the racist, black boxing fan. So anything that the non-black boxing fans are going to do to Crawford or Mayweather, Dante does the exact same shit to guys like Canelo, Inoue, or Usyk. So that's the issue with Dante.
Compare him to David. David is an exciting fighter. David's a fighter that people want to see. And the last performance, like I said, he came injured, but I'm proud of what he did.
So
he came and injured my ass. Every time overall a fighter ends up moving up in weight or ends up coming off of a performance that was not looked at as super great or didn't end up getting the stoppage, they're always coming into the fight injured. Please, I didn't hear about any particular injury that David Benavidez was going in there injured against. Now, of course, that's your son. You're making excuses for him, whatever. I get it. But at the end of the day, no one wants to hear that shit, bro. David Benavidez didn't come in there overall with no goddamn injury. In fact, from what I heard coming into that fight, David Benavidez stated that he felt the best that he had in his career. So let's stop with that shit right now.
Jose Sr., he says that his son, David Benavidez, is a fighter that fans want to see. Basically meaning Crawford is not a fighter that fans want to see. Now, if this was...
Well, what I'll state about Mr. Terence Bud Crawford is this. Crawford, I think, is a very interesting and a very entertaining fighter if you really truly appreciate boxing and that of the sweet science. And it's not like he's someone that's a Shakur Stevenson that is just completely a guy that I could see why maybe you don't want to watch his fights, because he's not putting anybody away and he really doesn't have, that athletic value, at least in terms of the punching power. Crawford is actually putting a lot of these guys away. Now, his last fight against Israel Madrimov, I didn't really find to be super entertaining. I thought that it was a close fight, but I really didn't find it super entertaining because in my view, it was a little bit lackluster. I thought that both fighters could have threw a little bit more, and I thought that Israel Madrimov, to be quite honest with you, I thought that he fought a little bit tentative and a little bit too timid, but it is what it is. Of course, he fought smart, but it's, in order to beat someone like a Crawford or in order to beat a fighter that is #1 pound for pound potential, you're going to have to get in there and really take the pace against him, and he just didn't do that. He let Terence Bud Crawford take the pace first, and you can't do that if you're going to win a fight. You have to control the pace, and Israel Madrimov did not know how to do that, at least not enough to win the fight.
Just some fan.
But that being stated, Terence Bud Crawford also is not this major star that a lot of people are trying to make him out to be. He's just not. And people will, bitch, moan, and complain about, oh, if Crawford was marketed in the right way and blah, 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 all sort of stuff. Well, they've been trying to market him for years. Crawford is just not an A grade, he is just not overall a superstar. It is what it is. He is just not an A grade level superstar. He's just not. Now, in terms of fighting ability, in terms of that, and in terms of accomplishments and Hall of Fame ability, yeah, Terence Bud Crawford is up there with a lot of all-time great fighters. He's up there with anyone in terms of his era. He's right there with Usyk and Canelo and those guys. In a way, he's right there with all those guys. But when you talk about star power, no, he's not Canelo and he's not Gervonta Tank Davis. To be honest with you, he really wasn't quite Errol Spence Jr. before Errol Spence Jr. started having the car accidents and other stuff like that. And that, by the way, is not me detracting the win that Crawford has over Errol Spence. All I'm saying is that Spence had more star power than Terence Crawford as well. To be honest with you, if Crawford wanted to be a little bit more of a star, he should have signed with the PBC a long-ass time ago. That way he could have had possible fights with Keith Thurman, Danny Garcia, Sean Porter. All this could have happened several years ago. But he's the one that decided to stay with Top Rank and not a Bob Arum. He's the one that decided to do that.
On the internet, hiding with a fake profile, we don't know who he is, he remains anonymous, then obviously it wouldn't matter if he said this. But the fact that Jose Benavidez, David Benavidez's own father and trainer, is saying this, you're forcing people to look at the actual numbers, the actual facts, and make a direct comparison between your son, David, and Terence Crawford. Now, there's no doubt about it that David Benavidez is definitely an exciting fighter. But statistically, there's nothing to suggest that David Benavidez is a more exciting fighter than Crawford. And there's certainly nothing.
Well, if we're going to compare Terence Crawford and David Benavidez, if we're comparing it to the average boxing fan, maybe one could state, at least subjectively, that David Benavidez is a more entertaining fighter to watch than that of a Terence Bud Crawford because he comes forward, he's primarily offensive, and you know mainly what his game plan is going to be. I personally find Terence Bud Crawford to be the more exciting of the two. For those of us that actually appreciate boxing and the sweet science, we more than likely like Terence Bud Crawford because not only does he bring knockouts and excitement, but he is an exceptionally skilled fighter. To be quite honest with you, David Benavidez, just in my personal view, even though I think that he's a relatively great fighter, I think it's only going to be a matter of time before that facade wears off. I mean, I believe that he has a great chance against Canelo because Canelo's getting up there a little bit. And on top of that, David's going to be at least 15 to 20 pounds bigger than Canelo on fight night. And he's going to be several inches taller. And he's going to be lengthier. But other than that, would I really favor him over Artur Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol? Not in my personal view. Just not in my personal view. I think that David Benavidez, I don't think that he's going to last as long as what some people think. We'll see what ends up happening. And Dante doesn't believe that shit either. That's why Dante and a lot of these LDBC and new media guys, they put so much stock into that of David Benavidez because he's pretty much a means to an end, once again, to tear down Canelo Alvarez and other fighters that they may need to. But, once again, once he wears out his welcome, they're not going to have any more use for him.
To suggest that David Benavidez, he takes more risk than Crawford does. Does he not know that Crawford was on a longer knockout streak than David Benavidez was? And Crawford was knocking out better competition? Once again, he says David is a fighter that fans want to see, as if they don't want to see Crawford. Did he not see the crowd that attended Crawford's last fight and how many celebrities and stars were there? Let me just put up a clip of the audience. And once again, this is the reason why Senior,
Well, it's great that Terence Bud Crawford has those guys show up for his fights, and I agree with that. But at the end of the day, the numbers also are the numbers. And Terence Bud Crawford's numbers have always been underwhelming. He had the fight against Errol Spence Jr. That was supposed to be the quote-unquote fight of the decade. That was supposed to be, allegedly, according to a lot of people, the biggest fight ever since Mayweather versus Pacquiao. And when that fight ended up happening, it couldn't even do 900,000 pay-per-view buys. Now, some people are like, well, 900,000 pay-per-view buys, that's a pretty big task, especially in today's pay-per-view. Right, but if we're going to say that it's the quote-unquote fight of the decade, that fight should have at least been able to do 1 million pay-per-view buys. Because recently, Gervonta Tank Davis versus Ryan Garcia was able to do that. So how come Crawford cannot bring in with Errol Spence Jr., someone who is a relatively good pay-per-view attraction? How come that fight can't even bring in 900,000 to 1 million pay-per-view buys? Because Canelo did it with Gennady Golovkin. Gervonta Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia were able to do it together. How come Crawford cannot do it? So the thing is about Crawford is that although he's an extraordinary fighter, Crawford, unfortunately for himself, he just doesn't have, that quality of being a quote-unquote star. There's a difference between being quote-unquote the best in your profession and being a quote-unquote star. When you talk about that at tennis, for example, Novak Djokovic is a big star, but I wouldn't say that he has the same star appeal, partially because of the media, of course. But, I wouldn't say that he has quite the same star appeal as a Rafael Nadal or a Roger Federer. Now, of course, a lot of that you can say is quote-unquote marketing, but it's also overall because, the way that Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, the era that they were a part of, and they came a little bit earlier. On top of that, where they're from and the companies and the opinions overall that they go into and maybe their personality, blah, 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 whatever it is. When you talk about that at the NBA, Nikola Jokic, in my view, right now is the #1 player in the world. I think that he's the best player in the league still. But that doesn't mean that he's more marketable than someone like a Stephen Curry or like someone like a LeBron James or someone like that, of a Zion Williamson or something like that. There's a difference between being the quote-unquote face of a sport in terms of marketability and being the quote-unquote best of your sport. And it's very rare, or, it can be a little bit more rare to where you can be both of those things. Like what a Michael Jordan could be for basketball or a LeBron James for basketball or maybe a Steph Curry. Or when you talk about that at tennis, a Rafael Nadal or a Roger Federer, to a degree, Novak Djokovic, soccer, Lionel Messi, or Ronaldo, but Messi for this generation, in my view, over Ronaldo. When you talk about that of the UFC, debatably at one time, Conor McGregor, maybe Chuck Liddell, when you talk about Anderson Silva, of course, when you talk about boxing in recent years, of course, it was Canelo Alvarez, Floyd Mayweather before him. But, it takes a rare combination in order for that to happen. Crawford does not have both of those qualities. What he has is excellent star quality in terms of his fighting ability and in terms of his accomplishments. That's what he has. But the thing is about Canelo, when you talk about his generation, this generation, Canelo was the guy that not only had the all-time great fighting tangibles, but he also had the marketability. It just is what it is. So these guys, Dante, and a lot of these guys, because they know that so many people try to tear down black fighters, they try to make a lot of black fighters into something that they're not. And at the end of the day, when you talk about the face of boxing for this generation, yes, it was Canelo Alvarez. And the facts are in the proof is in the pudding. Just is what it is.
Should not be making comparisons like this. Because by way of contrast, we never see all of those celebrities and superstars paying ringside tickets just to see David Benavidez. You could see big American superstars sitting in the front row cheering every time Crawford lands a punch. Those celebrities, they were there to watch Terence Crawford. And Terence, he wasn't even in there with a big name opponent. Excitement is being able to do things that other fighters cannot do. And doing it against the best in the world. Looking like a superhero in the ring. That's what excites fans the most. And we know.
Well, Terence Crawford did not look like a superhero in the ring against his last opponent, against Israel Madrimov. And listen, I think that Madrimov is a relatively great fighter. I would give him probably about the A- level because, once again, even though I think that he's, debatably the top guy at 154 other than Crawford, I don't know for sure. I need to see him in the ring against Virgil Ortiz and Tim Tszyu and Sebastian Fondora and some of those other guys. I don't know how he would look like. I would have to see that. It is what it is. And that's another thing that fanboys love to do, is, including that at DontaesBoxingNation and many other people. They like for to, bitch, moan, and complain about how your hypotheticals cannot be looked at as facts. And although I agree with that, what they will turn around and do is try to make their own hypotheticals into facts when it suits them. And we can't do that. We cannot base arguments off of hypotheticals. There are certain times where we can enter in a hypothetical maybe in order to prove our point a little bit or to try overall, to, compare it a little bit and say, well, what would we do in this situation or blah, 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 if this happened, if that happened. We can use it maybe to a slight degree, but it can never be the main basis of our argument. It can never be the main basis of our argument because if your main basis of your argument is a quote unquote hypothetical, then you really don't have an argument.
This to be true because the numbers prove it. Jose Benavidez, he just compared Terence Crawford, a fighter who knocks out almost all of his opponents, to Shakur Stevenson, which means when he said that, he wasn't basing what he said off of how many knockouts they get. So if Senior
I do somewhat agree with that.
is basically calling Crawford boring, then he's also saying that Floyd Mayweather is boring, Sugar Ray Leonard is boring, Muhammad Ali is boring. David Benavidez, he takes risk, and Crawford plays it safe. Either Senior has never really watched a Crawford fight outside of watching his son get knocked out by Crawford, Jose Benavidez, Or he's just using the same code words and language that race fans use to describe black fighters in general. As you guys have noticed, they haven't called Tyson Fury boring. They haven't called Vasil Lomachenko boring. Even El Rayo, who just beat Pitbull Cruz by move.
Well, some people overall, they actually have called Tyson Fury boring, but that's because Tyson Fury has kind of burned his own bridges as of late because people are starting to get tired of his shtick. Tyson Fury overall, once again, I admire him as a fighter. I think that he's a relatively great fighter. But at the end of the day, Tyson Fury keeps pulling in a lot of shenanigans that people are starting to get tired of his shit. To where overall he's one day going to fight this guy, then he's not going to fight this guy, then he's going to retire, then he's not going to retire, then he's going to do all this shit. At the end of the day, people are getting tired of the inauthenticity, and they're getting tired of that shit because at times it just comes across as a little bit too much mind games and a little bit of attention whoring. Now, I'm not quite sure if Tyson Fury is trying to attention whore necessarily, but sometimes when you come across as a little bit inconsistent with your energy, people can start to get a little bit tired of you.
Been around the ring and boxing. None of these non-black fans have called them boring for it. None of them have accused them of trying to play it safe. What makes it even more ironic,
I do somewhat agree with that, and that is one of the things that black fighters do have to go through in terms of some of the double standards that they go through. Now, that being stated, Dante's Boxing Nation and Aki TV and a lot of these LDBC and new media guys, they put out a lot of double standards as well compared to that of non-black fighters. But once again, that's a conversation for another time when that arises.
It was the bigger, stronger, younger Israel Madrimov was way more cautious than Terence Crawford, which was the smart thing.
But was Israel Madrimov really overall that much bigger? And this is why I also like to review videos like this, because Dante is always trying to put things in with revisionist history. Israel Madrimov really was not bigger than Terence Bud Crawford. Now, in terms of girth, yes, he was bigger, but it pretty much was evened out overall once again because Terence Bud Crawford has a 74-inch arm reach and he's 5'8". He was a little bit taller and definitely lengthier than that of Israel Madrimov. So at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, we can talk about that all we want to. But it's not like Terence Bud Crawford was outweighed by 2 weight classes over Israel Madrimov. And apparently, from what I'm hearing, Crawford rehydrated a little bit heavier than Madrimov on fight night. Now, that doesn't always mean everything because, of course, certain fighters, they balloon up a little bit to kind of make up for the new weight that they're moving up at. You know, kind of like what Canelo did against Bivol and also what Jamel Charlo did against Canelo. So that doesn't always mean that that's their 100% natural weight, at least when they're fighting in the ring. But at the end of the day, Crawford is not a small dude. He's been rehydrating at 160 for pretty much the past 10 years. Or not 10 years, but at least the past several years.
Thing for him to do, because if Jose Sr. was trained,
that's why I say when people are trying to compare that to the Canelo versus Dimitri Bivol fight or the Usyk versus Fury fight, it's not comparable. Like at all, because Crawford was moving up 1 weight class to where he was a little bit out of his element, and really this was a guy that pretty much is his natural same size, so it's really not that super duper comparable. You know, when you talk about, you know, that the Canelo versus Bivol fight, Canelo was probably outsized by about a weight class and a half, if not 2 weight classes. Now he ballooned up in weight, you know, in order to try to bully Bivol a little bit more, but it actually ended up as a disadvantage because he had even worse stamina than what he usually did in that fight. You know, so, you know, it didn't work out for him. And Usyk against Fury, I mean, forget it. Usyk was outweighed by 30 plus pounds by about 33 pounds. And on top of that, out-lengthened by several inches in height and reach. So it's really not even comparable.
Him, Jose would have got him knocked out. Madrimov, he definitely played it safe because he did not want to get knocked out. He knew how dangerous and how skilled Terence Crawford was and is. That's also the reason that Israel Madrimov was saying that Terence Crawford...
I agree with that, but what I will state is this. If Terence Bud Crawford is allegedly so far and ahead of his peers, Dante's Boxing Nation, Crawford should have been able to knock him out. It's no offense, but for a guy that allegedly is so far and ahead above Canelo and Usyk and blah, 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 like what Dante is trying to allege that he is, I never personally believed that. Now, if you wanted to state that he was better than those fighters or greater, that's up to you. I don't have a problem with that. Crawford has a debate in those conversations as being ahead of anyone for his generation. Canelo and Usyk, and in a way, in my view as well. But at the end of the day, you know, especially Canelo and Usyk. But when we talk about it once again, let's also call a spade a spade. It is what it is. Crawford was supposed to be a little bit more dominant in that fight than what he actually was.
Crawford is his favorite fighter, and not a David Benavidez. Once again, Jose Sr., he brought this on himself. This is not David Benavidez's fault at all. He's definitely a good fighter, one of the best fighters out there right now. But his father is trying to make him...
Now, you noticed overall with Ryan Garcia, when Ryan Garcia's father stated something, Of course, he also blamed it on that Ryan Garcia, but he's not blaming David Benavidez. He's trying to separate both the father and the son right now because he still has to use that of a David Benavidez. Jose Benavidez struck a chord now with Dante's Boxing Nation after staying this. And, I somewhat get why. But he has to now separate those two because, once again, he saw us to use David Benavidez as a pawn in order to try and tear down Canelo Alvarez on the throne.
Look bad by directly comparing his son to Crawford. When it comes to Bud, you have other fighters on the pound-for-pound list. I'm talking about high on the pound-for-pound list that praise Terence Crawford as if he's a superhero. From Alexander Usyk to Naoya Inoue, Shakur Stevenson, and all the way down to Madrimov. It's not
Absolutely, and you also had certain fighters that praised Canelo Alvarez, like Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, the Charlo brothers, and other people like that. But every time they praised Canelo Alvarez, it was because they were quote-unquote trying to appease the racist. That's also another thing about Dante's Boxing Nation. Everything that he says also has an agenda as well. So you have to really watch out with what Dante's Boxing Nation says. Because a lot of the stuff that he says overall, although it may have some relevance, a lot of it is going to be based off of his own bias, his own agenda, and his own insecurities and projection.
Coincidence that almost everything Jose just said about Shakur Stevenson and Terence Crawford, it was also said about Jack Johnson and Muhammad Ali, at least said by the race fans, of course. We know what time it is. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that was a very particularly interesting conversation. But I do agree with a little bit of what Dante's Boxing Nation stated. This is a double standard that black fighters have had to go through for a very long time. I'm not really surprised by this. But once again, you have to be careful with Dante's Boxing Nation as well, because a lot of the stuff that he does is also very racially motivated. And that's why, once again, they've been trying to tear down Canelo as not only a great boxer for the past several years, but also as the quote-unquote face of boxing. So it is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I just saw that video was very particularly interesting. Apparently, from what I'm hearing in recent news, Terence Bud Crawford, he may get a fight against that of Sebastian Fundora next, or they're trying to make that fight. They ordered it. I would love to see that fight, of course, because it would be a quote-unquote unification fight, at least somewhat. Not completely unification, but somewhat of a unification. And that'd be interesting because Fundora would be a decent amount bigger than Crawford. Of course, he's nowhere near Crawford in terms of skill set, in my personal view. But he's skilled enough and big enough to where he may provide Crawford with a little bit of problems. Sebastian Fundora is like, what, 6'6"? That's going to be an interesting fight if that happens. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.